Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Johnson Gonzalez, and I'm the director of the Center for Latino Research at DePaul University. Since it was established in 1985, the CLR has striven to open and sustain dialogues which foster the empowerment and advancement of Latinx communities. In addition to publishing Diálogo, an award-winning academic journal, the Center for Latino Research helps DePaul faculty to pursue their research through an annual fellowship competition. We also invite guest speakers to campus, and every year, in collaboration with the Office of Institutional Diversity and Equity, we serve as the hosts for the annual Latinx graduation ceremony for all graduating Latinx students at DePaul. This year, we'll be hosting the 25th anniversary graduation celebration. You can find more information about us by visiting go.depaul.edu/CLR. So please get in touch with us if we can help you. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our second symposium on the Latinx vote. I want to thank our two guests for joining us today. Our first guest is Dr. Benjamin Francis-Fallon, who is a professor of history at Western Carolina University and is the author of the book, The Rise of the Latino Vote, A History, published in 2019 by Harvard University Press. Our second guest is Dr. Bernard L. Fraga, a professor of political science at Emory University. He is the author of the book, The Turnout Gap, Race, Ethnicity, and Political Inequality in a Diversifying America, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. On behalf of the Center for Latino Research, we feel so lucky to have two such incredible and esteemed colleagues here with us. So I want to welcome you both and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. Before we begin, I want to be sure to thank our CLR program assistant, Alejandra Delgadillo, who has helped plan this event and is coordinating the technology we're using today. I'd also like to express our gratitude to our co-sponsors, the Center for Black Diaspora, the Departments of Political Science, Latin American and Latino Studies, African and Black Diaspora Studies, and History, and the Critical Ethnic Studies program. And finally, I especially want to thank Dr. Joe Tafoya, a professor in DePaul's Department of Political Science and himself an expert on the Latino vote. Dr. Tafoya organized this two-part symposium for us and will be moderating today's discussion with our esteemed guests. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Tafoya.
Hi, Billy. Thank you very much for the introduction. Hi there, everyone. I'm Professor Joe R. Tafoya, and I will be moderating this event. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy our guests are here, and I'm really happy that the audience is here. We are gathered here just 20 days from Election Day 2020 to discuss the Latinx vote ahead of the important election, this very important election. We come to you with special attention to the Latino vote, not only because of its potential to influence the election in battleground states like Florida or Pennsylvania, but also because of the larger questions it raises about the nature of campaigning for president and access to the hard-fought quintessential participatory act of voting. On the campaigning side, a recent poll by Latino Decisions and Naleo found that 65% of Latinos plan to vote for Biden or lean toward voting for him. But this is still 14% lower than the 79% of Latino voters who said they supported Clinton ahead of Election Day 2016. So we have seen a surge of Latino support for President Trump, but among specific demographic groups. With this, how relevant is it to think of the Latino vote as a voting bloc? What challenges do its size and diversity pose for candidates? Additionally, fears about Republicans stealing the election by limiting the right to vote are common. In Texas, Governor Greg Abbott has limited drop-off boxes for vote-by-mail ballots to one per county, despite places like Harris County, where Houston is, having 2.4 million voters that are predominantly Latino. The Republican Party has also admitted to setting up and operating illegitimate drop-off boxes in the Latino populous region of Southern California. With long lines to vote, issues with voting by mail, and a pandemic looming over the electoral process, what threats to the right to vote do Latinos face? To discuss these topics, I'm accompanied by our guests, Professors Benjamin Francis-Fallon and Professor Bernard Fraga. And I am also accompanied by you, our audience. We welcome your questions as the event proceeds. Please feel free to put them in the chat box and we will get to them at the end of our discussion. So proceeding with our discussion, I'd like to hand the floor over to Professor Benjamin Francis-Fallon, who is going to give us a presentation about his book, The Rise of the Latino Vote.
Thanks. Hopefully everything is working with my screen share. It's very nice to be here. Thanks especially to Professor Tafoya for the invitation. And thanks to the Center for Latino Research and the many other DePaul supporters of this event. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon because last year I published this book called The Rise of the Latino Vote. And my job today is to talk about kind of two of the big questions that I explore in the book. Now, the first is, how did the diverse US populations of Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans, not to mention other US residents of Latin American origin, actually come to be seen as one political community? And second, how have people actually tried to mobilize voters around a shared Hispanic or Latino identity? Now, the first thing to appreciate is that we talk a lot about the Latino vote, right? But the Latino vote was hardly a natural occurrence. Rather, it was painstakingly made over decades. The outline of the Latino vote first came into view in the presidential election of 1960. And this was when Mexican American Democrats, who were led by a Los Angeles City Councilman named Edward Roybal, they set up a parallel voter mobilization drive for presidential candidate John F. Kennedy and his running mate Lyndon Johnson. And these were called the Viva Kennedy Clubs. Now, they were rooted in the Southwest, but they came to include Puerto Ricans as well, mostly in New York City. And the image here shows this historic collaboration of Mexican Americans from the Southwest and New York Puerto Ricans, united in support of John Kennedy. And it was in such moments that Viva Kennedy enshrined the presidential campaign as the central ritual in the creation of a national Latino political identity. Now, this moment notwithstanding, Southwesterners and New Yorkers rarely interacted during the campaign. And Kennedy had very little use for a united Latino electorate once he was in office, and he worked to demobilize his backers soon after the election. And without the collective focus of the Viva Kennedy campaign, Puerto Rican and Mexican American leaders largely went their separate ways. The image of a nationwide political bloc was really just that, an image. However, a handful of Mexican American elected officials capitalized upon their Viva Kennedy activism to ascend in national politics. Most importantly, Edward Roybal, seen in your center there, won election to the US House of Representatives in 1962. And he became the first Mexican American from California to join the House since the late 19th century. Thanks to Roybal and his fellow Viva Kennedy campaigners, Henry B. Gonzalez of Texas and Joseph Montoya of New Mexico, the Mexican American presence in Congress doubled by the mid-1960s. It only was 4, but it was something, and it was a start. And with new leaders in national politics, the civil rights revolutions of the 1960s thrust Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans even further into national political life. But again, they tended to do so on different trajectories. Mexican American leaders witnessed Black civil rights activism capturing the nation's attention, and they began to claim that the discrimination that their people endured was just as pervasive as any bigotry African Americans suffered in the South. And they wondered when Presidents Kennedy and then later Johnson would bring the power of Washington to bear on their needs. Quietly at first, and then ever more loudly, Mexican American leaders began calling their people the country's second largest minority. But again, they were really just speaking about Mexican Americans there. Puerto Ricans didn't easily fit into this conversation. People with their own homeland and concentrated in a handful of cities in the Northeast and Midwest, they couldn't make a claim of being a national minority. And while on the national stage, it appeared that Mexican Americans often viewed African Americans as competitors, Puerto Ricans and African Americans were meaningful allies in New York and elsewhere. This fact helped Puerto Ricans actually to be included in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was otherwise focused on the Deep South. Inclusion in the act brought the end of New York State's literacy test, which was then widely used to disenfranchise Puerto Ricans in the mid-1960s. In that very same year, 1965, Puerto Ricans and African Americans joined together to elect a young Puerto Rican reformer named Herman Badillo to the borough presidency of the Bronx. And Badillo was a liberal Democrat who got his start campaigning for John Kennedy in 1960, and he became one of the city's only Puerto Rican elected officials. In 1970, he became the first Puerto Rican elected to Congress from the mainland. And in Washington, he would meet none other than Los Angeles Representative Edward Roybal. And from the late 1960s on, these two elected officials took the lead in uniting the diverse communities of what was then called Spanish-speaking America into an electoral force. Veterans of the 1960 Viva Kennedy campaign, they knew what it was like to be used by a presidential candidate. And so they set about trying to organize a new alliance where they themselves would be the ones who called the shots. A watershed, oops, sorry, I jumped ahead there. A watershed moment took place in 1971 when the two congressmen hosted the UNIDOS conference. At this event, more than 1,000 people came to Washington, D.C. from across the country to build what they called the Spanish-speaking coalition. As Latinos from different regions and national origins got to know each other, they debated what it really meant to be united. And they discussed whether it was they were building a coalition of existing peoples, or whether instead they were trying to create a new US-based community that transcended national origins. Whatever their views, they managed together to develop a liberal Spanish-speaking policy agenda. This was the very first statement of community principles that showed the great possibility of molding Latinos into a progressive force nationwide. After the conference, Roybal and Badillo continued to make the shift from a national origin politics, Mexican, American, Puerto Rican, Cuban, to a pan-Latino politics. In 1975, they led the fight to expand the Voting Rights Act. Through their efforts, all Spanish-speaking Americans became a protected language minority in election law. That same year, Congress passed another Roybal bill. It forced the federal government to publish monthly statistics on the condition of all Spanish origin Americans. And this in turn paved the way for the creation of the Hispanic category in subsequent US censuses. And having that statistic really further amalgamated Latino communities in the national imagination. Roybal and Badillo also built new pan-Latino organizations. And there were many, but in 1976, the best known is the Congressional Hispanic Caucus that was founded that year. All along the way, they had to battle against Democrats like Jimmy Carter, who preferred to treat Latinos like white ethnics, that is to say, like Italians or like Poles, people who they could claim would assimilate into the mainstream and eventually kind of just be regular Americans, rather than like the permanent minority group that Latinos insisted that they were. Now, transforming Democrats into a truly multicultural party wasn't just about convincing officials to recognize Latinos as a distinct piece of the American mosaic. It was fundamentally also about reinvigorating Democrats' commitment to progressive economics. The 1970s were a time of high unemployment and inflation. There was lots of working class suffering. And Edward Roybal was one who creatively redefined the Latino political community to meet those needs, the needs of the day. In 1976, he spoke before Democrats and he told them that the first of the core values that defined what he called the Latino community was a strong and vibrant family structure. But he argued that economic security was the social cement which holds the family together. He claimed too that full employment, affirmative action policies, and national health insurance were essential to supporting this thing, the Latino family. Unemployment, underemployment, and job discrimination, he said, were inherently anti-family. While conservatives spent the 1970s employing this family values discourse in order to roll back and discredit government programs, Roybal creatively fused class and culture to defend his people and the social safety net. Some Democrats would struggle to square their commitments to diversity and economic fairness, yet Latino leaders advanced a powerful synthesis of the two. This vision of interlocking economic and cultural security would to this day have the potential to transform the Democratic Party and the country. Now, the forging of Latino politics transformed the Republican Party as well. In the late 1960s, a self-described Hispanic Republican movement began to emerge among Mexican Americans in the Southwest. Its members had powerful allies. Republicans such as Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon envisioned replacing the party's dwindling African American constituency in northern industrial states with Mexican Americans who lived in the Sun Belt. Conservative Republicans hoped that Mexican Americans would partner more easily with the party's growing base of white conservatives. There was a sense among Republicans that both groups could unite in a shared resentment over how the civil rights revolution of the 1960s was unfolding. Now, Republicans faced a problem, however, and that was how to reconcile their desire to win over middle-class Mexican Americans with the growing expectation that all Spanish-speaking Americans belonged to one constituency. Richard Nixon's White House aides even gave a name to this new dilemma that they confronted in Latino panethnicity. They called it the Spanish-speaking concept. Now, some Republicans wanted to expand their party's Mexican-American strategy to Puerto Ricans, yet Richard Nixon saw Puerto Ricans as diehard liberals who had no place in his party going forward. And race was another factor working against Puerto Ricans' inclusion. According to one Republican operative, some Puerto Ricans, this I'm quoting, some Puerto Ricans are Black and no one knows how many, end quote. Therefore, Nixon's strategy of fomenting so-called Black-Brown rivalry would not work with them, nor would Republican attacks on the use of busing to promote school integration. Now, the Nixon White House solved its problems by creating programs that on their surface treated Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans as members of one group. Nixon, for example, extended affirmative action in federal employment to Spanish-speaking Americans. And he created a so-called brown capitalism program, which was aimed at building up a small Latino business elite that ran from coast to coast. But beneath that surface, it was obvious that the Nixon administration was playing favorites. More than 1/3 of federal small business financing under this program went to Miami, the capital of Cuban America. And of the remainder, 3/4 went to the Southwest. This was a virtual guarantee that Puerto Ricans would receive only a small benefit from the program. And through such targeted appeals, Nixon still managed to win 1/3 of the Latino vote in his 1972 reelection, then a modern record for a Republican. But it also reinforced a pattern that would continue. The US president was always looking out for himself and was just as willing to divide Latino constituencies from one another as he was to promote their solidarity. Hispanic activists in the Republican Party learned they couldn't necessarily trust the Spanish-speaking concept to the president. And so in 1974, GOP activists and elected officials tried to unite their factions in a new organization that they called the Republican National Hispanic Assembly. It was headed by a Los Angeles business consultant named Benjamin Francis. A Mexican American, Francis built his national partisan organization by enlisting other well-to-do people, businessmen, medical doctors, and professionals. Members of the assembly tended to equate their personal economic success with Hispanic progress. And this form of ethnic individualism established the assembly and the party, and even paved the way for Francis to run for the presidency in 1980. Now, while Francis tried to forge an influential place for Hispanics within the multicultural GOP, party conservative activists made it pretty difficult. Conservatives attacked affirmative action and minority small business programs, and these had been the things that were the lifeblood of recruiting moderate Latinos to the GOP. Undocumented immigration from Mexico added to Republicans' challenges. Republican presidents like Gerald Ford might have wanted to reach out to Mexican Americans, but they found themselves more often pandering to anti-immigrant sentiment in an effort to cover their right flank. The GOP Hispanic coalition was also evolving. More Cubans were becoming US citizens and more engaged in the US political system in the 1970s. And one important, whether they belonged to the Latino vote was an open question. One important Cuban American Republican spoke for many when she repudiated her party's Hispanic assembly. And quoting here, "The Cubans are unlike other Spanish-speaking ethnics with whom they are consistently and wrongly grouped," she claimed. Ben Fernandez's Washington-based Mexican clique, she said, did not represent her people, the Cubans. What followed was a strange twist. By the early 1980s, Cuban Republicans who had long rejected any association with American Latinos ended up actually being drawn into Hispanic politics, not necessarily because they wanted to, but because they wanted to prevent Mexican Americans from speaking on their behalf. Cuban leaders actually took over the Republican National Hispanic Assembly in 1982, and then set about using it to advance the goals of their hero, Ronald Reagan. And the Cubans' formulation of Hispanic politics kept the tradition of anti-Blackness that they had inherited from Richard Nixon, but it rejected the use of government aid and affirmative action as tools for winning Latino support. Instead, the Cuban leaders advocated creating new Hispanic issues that were aligned with the aims of the conservative movement. So Hispanic Republicans endorsed an aggressive and interventionist foreign policy abroad, especially in Latin America. And they married this to a punitive crime policy, restrictions on abortion, support for school prayer, and aid to parochial schools. And these were Hispanic positions built for the conservatism of the 1980s. By the 1980s, then, what constituted Latino or Hispanic issues was shown to be extraordinarily malleable. And leaders of both parties had also shown that they were just as willing to disorganize this constituency as they were to unite it. The Latino vote was an accepted fact, but Latino power was still very much in the making. Thank you, and I'm happy to be discussing this as we go forward.
Wonderful presentation, Benjamin. I appreciate its content, and I think it provides to us a lot of great contextual background to a lot of us that study Latino politics. You're coming from a point of view of history, and a lot of us that study political science don't have this contextual background. So it's great to see it. It's great to have reviewed it from your book. I'm curious about the aspect of your presentation that talked about presidential politics dividing Latinos. Democrats and Republicans have attempted to define Latino voters to suit their electoral needs. Do you see this practice sort of continuing today, especially with the 2020 election?
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, I guess there are two things to say. Democrats have had to unite and balance large amounts of Mexican American constituents and Puerto Rican constituents, whereas Republicans have really had to try to convert the sections of that community that they have needed in any sort of particular time. So they have two different projects really, but definitely in the present day, we see a strong tendency among Democrats and Republicans to play to an immigrant identity as being kind of fundamental to who Latinos are. So in the case of Joe Biden, if you look at speeches, if you look at his website, he's talking about Latinos as a contributing part of the society that has not yet been dealt in, has not been sort of given full access to the benefits of American society, typically within this kind of immigrant framing. If you look at how Donald Trump has approached Latino constituencies, I think there's also this strong attempt to play up Latinos as immigrants, but who are already successful, but in danger of losing their success in the event of Democrats retaking the White House. And so this is in particular trained on the notion that Democrats are supposedly bringing a socialism and that Latinos are experts in the perils of socialism on the basis of their previous experiences in places like Cuba or Venezuela. So there's a definite effort to push the kind of concept of Latino as immigrant in the present moment, but to very different ends.
Very interesting. Since your work's time frame, right, I believe that your book stops in around the mid-1980s. A good deal of national diversity has characterized Latinos due to increased immigration. Would you say that a Latino voting bloc is possible now?
I don't know. I mean, maybe this is a question of terminology, but if we're imagining that Latinos as a constituency will go 90-10 for one candidate, this seems pretty unrealistic. If we, as I've tried to indicate here, Republicans, so most Latinos are Democrats, most Latinos have been Democrats for some time, but Republicans have been working at this game for 50 years and have built a sort of durable set of allegiances among lots of Latino voters, regardless of what the platform says, people identify as Republicans. So the additional complexity brought to the situation by new migration streams from different national origins in Latin America is certainly a complicated factor. I think one of the tendencies in Latino political history is for there to be some kind of anxiety about people disagreeing. And I think there's been a tendency, and Cristina Beltran and others have noticed this, everybody has to be on the same page. But if you think about Latino politics as being coalitional, if you think about different nationalities coming together under a banner and trying to not just identify the stuff that they all agree upon, but actually working to support each other's different needs, then maybe it's more possible than it seems, but it's certainly not easy.
And we're thinking about the 2020 election as occurring differently or shaking out differently in various states, right? And one of the states that is being said a lot about is Florida, right? Where you have a predominantly Cuban constituency there, alongside growing constituencies or populations of Puerto Rican Americans that have fled the island because of natural disasters. Are the two ideologically incompatible in a place like that? What are we likely to see?
You know, very, very different trajectories historically. And I think the first thing to say about Cubans in Florida is something that probably lots of people know, that Cubans have viewed themselves as exceptional in the history of American Latinos. And as I tried to indicate in the talk, have not just felt themselves exceptional, but felt themselves in many ways superior to the other populations. So that's a complicating factor. And, you know, timing matters, and Cubans having established themselves first in Florida, you know, letting in additional groups to the structures of power. I can very much envision Cubans wanting Republican Puerto Ricans to join their party, but I don't imagine that they would let them speak for them anytime soon. You know, it's a junior partnership. So yeah, I think they're very, very different constituencies there.
So maybe there's a potential for some tension there. Definitely differences in voting patterns.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So we'll stop it here, and we'll follow up with Professor Bernard L. Fraga to see what he has to tell us in terms of the barriers to voting that are affecting various constituencies of Latino voters. Where are you? There you are.
Great. Everyone can see my screen. Yeah, it's working.
Yes, perfect.
Great. So thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak a little bit more about my research, especially at this critical time, not just for academics who are studying these topics, but at a critical time for our country and really for our democracy. And I also want to say that I appreciate hearing from Professor Francis-Fallon about the history that we see in terms of the Latino vote, in terms of the Latino electorate, the Latinx population more broadly, and the political power that we could wield if we work together, maybe if we work with one party or the other. Now, in today's talk, I want to start with a little bit of history, but I also want to talk about my background as a political scientist. I study voter turnout in elections and think a lot about who participates and who doesn't. But of course, when thinking about that topic, we have to begin with thinking about the challenges and the opportunities that we see for different groups in the electorate. So I want to start by showing, if I can get this to work, this is a chart that plots the rates of voter turnout that we see for the non-Hispanic white population and for the African-American population over time since the 1940s. Now, this data is based on surveys that were taken by the US government through the Current Population Survey or the American National Election Studies back in the 40s and 50s. But what it shows is the percentage of the population by racial and ethnic group that is eligible to vote, that decided to vote, that decided to participate in presidential elections. Again, going back all the way to the 1940s to 2016, our most recent presidential election. And what you can see is a couple of trends. First of all, when we look at the rate of turnout for whites, we can see turnout has declined somewhat, maybe from 70 to 80% of whites who could vote actually turning out to now something more like 65% in 2016. And if you look at African-American turnout, again, a group that historically has been disenfranchised and faced the most severe forms of not just voter suppression and repression, but restriction from even the ability to participate after surmounting all the kinds of suppression that we hear about today, we see that there was a rapid increase in Black voter turnout in the 1950s and 1960s up until the point of the Voting Rights Act, and then it's been sustained through the 1970s and 1980s, maybe increasing somewhat in the years that Barack Obama, of course, the first African-American major party nominee for president, was able to win election and re-election in 2008 and 2012, but is about the same or a little bit lower than the rate of turnout for non-Hispanic whites. So this implies two things. One is that the rate of voter turnout has changed over time for different groups, and also that a group like African Americans who have faced many barriers to participation were able to surmount those barriers through the Voting Rights Act and other policies. But still today, in the context of voter suppression, there might be a gap or a disparity in voter turnout between whites, the majority, and African Americans. Now, I'm going to add to this chart the line for the Latinx population. And as all of you can see, the rate of voter turnout, again, among eligible adults, that's citizens of voting age or Latinx, is significantly lower than the rate of voter turnout that we see for African Americans or for non-Hispanic whites. In fact, 10 to 20 percentage points lower in presidential elections, and in midterm elections, an even larger disparity of perhaps 25 percentage points. That means that, for example, in 2008, when African American turnout and white voter turnout were about equal at around 65%, just half of Latinx citizen adults who could participate turned out to vote. And in 2016, voter turnout was lower still, less than half of Latinx, again, adult citizens, this is people who are eligible to vote, actually participated in that pivotal, as we know now, election. Another thing to notice is the rate of voter turnout for the Latinx population hasn't really gone up very much since where it was in the 1970s and 1980s. If anything, it might have gone down a little bit even. And if you look at midterm elections in 2014, Latinx turnout was the lowest it's ever been, and in 2018 it went up, but turnout went up for everybody as well. Now, if we add Asian Americans to the chart, we can see a similar pattern to the Latinx population that's led to a lot of speculation in academic circles about the role of things like recent immigrant history. Again, these are all citizens, but having a history of immigration in your family, language barriers being key, and other factors that might be unique to the Latinx and Asian American population. But it still begs the question of why Latinx turnout is so low today, decades after the Voting Rights Act was applied to the Latinx population, as we just heard, language barriers were removed, and the notion of the sleeping giant has been dispelled, where in 2020, Latinx voters will make up the largest racial and ethnic minority group in the US electorate. So again, these are difficult questions to answer, but I try and get at some of them in my recent book, The Turnout Gap. In that book, I look at rates of turnout for whites, African Americans, Latinxs, and Asian Americans in a similar manner to what I just showed you, looking for patterns and trends at the state, national, and even sub-state and congressional district level, a topic that I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A as well. But a few of the key findings there as it applies to Latinx voters in particular. First is that we see big socioeconomic differences between people of color, broadly defined, and the white population. We've known this historically for some time. We've known that the rate of family income, lower rates of education among Latinx populations, both income and education are tied to turnout, so maybe it makes sense that turnout is lower, again, for this important racial and ethnic group. In addition, as I mentioned, as we saw in the last presentation as well, a history of discrimination and voting restrictions has been really key in suppressing the vote, at least in the past. Now today, those restrictions are less severe, although they still exist and persist, but the formal types of discrimination, the legacy of those forms of discrimination might still tell prospective Latinx voters that their vote is not as valuable as, for example, the white population that has faced fewer of those restrictions. A third major factor that I talk about a good bit in the book and gets a lot of attention in the media is contemporary vote suppression. Now, this is different from historical vote suppression when there were actual legal restrictions on who could vote or become a citizen. This is methods now that are a little bit more, how do you say, hidden perhaps, a little bit harder to define as explicitly racial. And again, this is something that we spend a lot of time talking about, not just in the 2020 election, but in 2018, 2016, other recent elections as well. Many people feel that this contributed, for example, to Donald Trump's victory in 2016, and that if Trump were to win in 2020, vote suppression might be a big part of the story. Now, as a quick aside, we are seeing, as I mentioned, signs that this could be a factor, especially in states where the Latinx population makes up a large share of the potential electorate. Just yesterday, in the state of Texas, after a back and forth in the courts, it appears that Republican Governor Greg Abbott is going to be able to restrict the number of ballot drop-off sites in Texas counties to 1 per county, which means that in large counties, like where Houston and Dallas are, there'll only be 1 place where individuals can drop off their ballot if they don't want to vote in person on election day or early. But if we look beyond the scope of voter suppression, at least voter suppression as conventionally defined, we see that another factor that contributes to low Latinx turnout is a lack of engagement and mobilization with Latinx voters, a lack of mobilization engagement on the part of campaigns, again, the people who are supposed to be trying to earn the vote, the Latinx community, maybe aren't doing as much as they should to really mobilize those voters. Now, I spent a lot of time in my book talking about this explanation because the evidence that I find is that in places where Latinx voters are perceived to be important by campaigns and outside organizations, in places where there's a concerted investment to actually engage and mobilize Latinos, that's where we see rates of Latinx turnout that are high and in some cases even exceed other racial and ethnic groups. So again, I think this explanation is really key, and thinking about the techniques and the ways in which mobilization happens are also an important part of the story. Now, with that in mind, the Latinx population beyond the socioeconomic kind of story is also different from other racial ethnic minority groups on one important factor, and that is age. Now, the audience that I'm speaking to, I think understands this pretty well, but just to emphasize the point, the Latinx population is far younger than other racial and ethnic groups on average, especially when looking at citizens. In fact, half of Latinxs are under the age of 27 in the United States today. That's the median age, under the age of 27, right? So we're not just talking about millennials, we're talking about Gen Z, disproportionately represented among Latinxs. And since we know age is related to turnout and that older voters vote more than younger voters, this is also part of the story for why Latinx turnout is so low. But what this means is that there's a large share of the Latinx population that wasn't able to participate even in the last presidential election. In fact, 4.5 million Latinx adult citizens were too young to vote in 2016. That is, they were younger than 18, but now they're eligible in 2020, right? So when we think about the narratives of 2016, but also the work that campaigns have to do to reach first-time voters and young voters in particular, that means they're going to disproportionately need to target and use approaches tailored to our communities, to the Latinx community. In addition, half of Latinx voters in 2020 were too young to vote just as recently as 2008. So when we talk about the Latinx electorate and think about changes in dynamics and who's voting for who and historical support, again, half of what we call the Latinx electorate today wasn't even eligible to vote in 2008. Half of those voters are completely new to the political scene and maybe are thinking about politics in a different way than those that remember the rhetoric in the campaign of Barack Obama. Now, I'm not going to, criticize Barack Obama's mobilization strategy for the Latinx population. We saw the numbers, turnout was low. It wasn't terribly low, perhaps, compared to other years, but it's not exactly improving versus historical records. So despite seeing record African-American turnout, we didn't see a historic record in Latinx turnout, at least not something identifiable. And Barack Obama did try and reach out to and got a lot of support from the Latinx community, but the mobilization strategies that he employed in many ways were similar to what candidates had done in the past. Maybe holding some rallies and events where there were Mexican-American, other Latino subgroup kind of cultural references, but some of that seemed to fall flat. Now, in 2016, Hillary Clinton's campaign took a little bit different of an approach. I think many political scientists would agree that Clinton really banked on high Latinx turnout in 2016 as carrying her to victory in Florida, but also other states in the Southwest, Arizona included, and maybe even in states like North Carolina and Georgia, where a relatively small Latinx population could still be pivotal in election outcomes. Mobilization strategies she used were somewhat more targeted to Latinxs as well. The picture you're seeing there is a picture of a traditional Caribbean, especially Cuban American pastry called the pastelito that has the logo of the Hillary for America campaign on it. And these were handed out at early voting sites to try and tell voters, right, in campaign rallies as well, to vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, jumping to the 2020 campaign and the primary, one thing that we noticed is that Bernie Sanders seemed to be able to tap into, especially young Latinx support, in a way that we really didn't see for any other Democratic presidential candidate, including the eventual nominee, Joe Biden. He was able to garner support from young kind of vanguard, right? Very, very progressive Latina leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, but earned him the moniker Tio Bernie. And Chuck Rocha has a recent book, one of his campaign managers, talking about his outreach strategy that emphasized issues that Latinx voters, especially young Latinx voters, really care about the most. Things like climate change, talking about trying to remedy issues of income inequality, as is mentioned in this tweet, healthcare. Those issues seem to really resonate with young Latinx voters. And what we've seen among Democrats perhaps is the beginnings of a transformation of thinking of the Latinx vote as a kind of ethnic group that needs an ethnic appeal to an ethnic group that needs an appeal that is addressing the real needs of the community. Now, beyond the presidential campaigns and what we've seen from politicians, there are also nonprofit and community-based organizations that are doing some amazing new work that's tapping into young Latino voters, young Latinx voters in new ways. Now, this is an example from an organization called Jolt Texas. Jolt Action in Texas is an organization that is trying to mobilize young Latinx voters to change the political scene in Texas, that state that I mentioned before, doing this massive voter suppression effort perhaps. And this strategy that they're highlighting on their website is called Poder Quince, referencing quinceañeras, a traditional kind of coming of age celebration for Latino women, especially Mexican Americans, right? And what they do is at these events, again, girls are just turning 15 years old, they're not eligible to vote, but they recruit young women to indicate how important voting is and how important civic engagement is to the families, right, of these 15-year-olds to try and boost voter turnout in that method. So again, using a cultural approach, but that is addressing the issues and concerns of young Latinx voters as well. And I think when we think about approaches going forward, I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A, we see that an emphasis on not just Latinx voters, but the young Latinx voters might be the key to success for remedying low rates of voter turnout and might need more attention by campaigns across the political spectrum if we want to see a real change in disparities in political participation. With that, I'll open up to questions from Joe and from the rest of you in just a little bit. Thank you very much.
Bernard, thank you very much for that presentation. I think it's beneficial to our college age audience, right, to really get to know the opportunity that they represent for this election, for this 2020 election. Some of what you shared, I had no idea about, right, about how young the Latino vote is and how much of it was not eligible to vote back in 2018, let alone 2016. So Latinos are known for low voter turnout that isn't wholly explained by gerrymandering and voter suppression. How does self-worth and significance in impacting the race matter to the Latino vote?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I think you're absolutely right about the role of kind of efficacy, feeling like you can make a difference in determining who votes. Now, other political science research conducted mostly on non-Hispanic whites finds that that's a key factor that motivates people to participate. Do you feel like your vote counts? Do you feel like your vote matters? Now, gerrymandering plays into that a little bit with the Latinx population. Many Latinx Americans live in districts where their vote doesn't seem to count. So either gerrymandered heavily to favor Republicans who are not supported by a majority of the Latinx population, or they're in heavily Democratic districts that are competitive where candidates have little incentive to actually mobilize and little incentive to tell Latinx voters that they count. But if we think about changes that are afoot, especially in the way campaigns are conducted, and the key role that Latinx voters might be playing from the perspective of community organizations like Jolt Action that I mentioned before in Texas, we can see that they are trying to shape the sense of efficacy and effectiveness of Latino voters themselves, independent of what the campaigns might perceive. Right. In fact, they're trying to tell, especially young Latinx voters, that your vote can matter, and if you want to see change in your communities, you can do it. It starts with voting, getting active in your communities. Doesn't end there, obviously, but that's the necessary starting point if we want to see electoral and participatory change.
Another question I had is about the load of misinformation that's sort of swirling around when it comes to Latino voters. So there's a lot of misinformation targeting the Latino community, including misleading messages about vote by mail and threats that ICE might be lurking at polling locations. How might officials and campaigns counteract this misinformation that's swirling around?
Well, when you talk about misinformation, I think you have to start talking about the source of this misinformation. And oftentimes it comes from the very top of our government. And I think that's important because, as much as there might be rumors flying around or disinformation, even from other countries, when election officials or the people that we elect and then their surrogates on the campaign trail are saying things like there's going to be monitoring at the polls, it rightly scares minority voters and especially Latinx voters who know the impact of the kind of police presence in their community, especially if they have undocumented or out of status family members, right, who might accompany them to the polls even if they can't vote themselves, or can drive them to the polls, right? So I think this could have a real impact In terms of changing it, it again starts with elected officials, ensuring Americans that the elections process is safe, that, for example, mail ballots are a safe way to vote in every state, that their ballots will be counted if they cast them, that their votes will matter in the election, but also that forms of voter intimidation, like individuals showing up at polling places, shouting things, waving campaign flags, that those are not going to be tolerated and are going to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Because again, the law says that that kind of voter intimidation is not only not permitted, is not only frowned upon, but illegal, and results in fines, if not prison time as well. So for those who are thinking about voting, you can trust that beyond long lines and other issues with drop box availability, if voter intimidation occurs, it will be prosecuted.
Do we have any indications from current events, right, of folks, elected officials doing this? Attorneys general, for example, coming down hard on people putting out voter intimidation?
Well, one thing that we saw is a direct form of voter intimidation in, I believe, the Democratic primaries in Virginia, right, earlier this year, where I think, a small group of individuals who were supporting the president, right, showed up at a polling place and were standing outside brandishing campaign flags, which is not allowed within a certain perimeter area, if you've ever seen that in Virginia and in other states. And they were actually fined. They were actually charged, right, with voter intimidation. So while we haven't seen this obviously in the context of early voting yet, which has just started, I do expect that if there are instances of this occurring in any state, including in a state with a Republican attorney general, that it will be prosecuted and those individuals will be charged.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate you responding to my questions. I have a set of other questions, more generally thinking broadly about the campaign, and this one goes out to Benjamin. President Trump's standing among the Latino community has improved since 2016, with Biden falling behind Clinton's pace. How might some Latinos find Trump's economic message appealing? Is Republican appeal on economic terms new?
It's definitely not new. Republicans have always had it. Democrats and Republicans appeal on the economy when they're talking to Latinos, but they appeal in different ways. And so Republicans' economic appeal has always been built around aspiring and middle class Latinos, people who have made it, and to validate them as sort of exemplars of the values and the traits that make their group great. So when Republicans talk to Latinos, they talk about their family and how you work hard for your family, and you know that this is a cornerstone of America, to maintain that structure. And sometimes that's an implicit dig at African Americans, who they like to advise Latino voters, have somehow an inferior work ethic and the family structures to look down upon. So it's always there. And Democrats, generally in the past at least, have spoken more to a working class economic vision of who Latinos are. Trump has definitely made the economy a centerpiece of his campaign, even as it's been falling apart. It seems to me, though, that there's a gender aspect of this that I've been reading about lately, and maybe you might be able to speak to it too, but it seems as if the economic message of Trumpism has a particular resonance with men, because the job creation and family support and reinforcing kind of male influence within the family sphere has been kind of a message within that. And if you think about Biden's economic message, one of the key pieces of it is around the security that comes with healthcare. And so that doesn't sort of strike the gendered chord quite in the same way. And I think, but it also maybe appeals to women, to Latinas more as well. So there's a couple of things going on there, but I think the gender one seems like it's pretty important these days.
One of the questions that I wanted to get to as well is about Biden's strategy toward Latinos, and this could be for the two of you to help me sort of flesh out. Biden's issue with Latinos goes back to the primaries, with Bernie Sanders winning 71% of Latinos under the age of 30, and in his campaign structure and strategy, including Latinos, unlike Biden's. We also see that Biden remains unknown among many Latinos whose support increases when they learn more about his platform. What could Biden be doing better to mobilize Latino voters?
I think it's key for him to engage with community organizations, to really engage with the grassroots. And one of the things that we see in the example that I gave you from Joel, Texas, is that when, you have Latinx leadership in organizations, and, Latinx people making the calls about what makes sense as a voter mobilization strategy, what campaign messages work, what policy platform should look like, that's when you see real changes in terms of support and in terms of engagement and mobilization. That's what you saw to some degree in the Bernie Sanders campaign, right? And to some degree, you're seeing it now in the Joe Biden campaign and some of the shifts that they're doing, right? So originally an approach that was going to be all digital, well, there was actually an understanding that that was going to miss a significant share of the Latinx population, including in states like Florida, might soften up some of his support with older Cuban American voters that, while majority Republican, in some ways are trending Democratic, at least some signs of that. So I think that it's about making sure that you have not only organizations involved and on the ground doing a lot of the mobilization organizations that have been involved in Latinx communities for a long time, but making sure you have Latinx leadership, advising campaigns and doing the work of strategy.
If I might just jump in for a second, I think it's clear that Sanders made Latino voters an absolute pillar of his primary run, and Joe Biden, at best, Latino voters were a secondary factor. And so there's a pivot there, and there's a catch-up that has to happen. Now, Joe Biden won the primary, so you can't argue with the strategy, but it's clear that for the longest time, it's still been difficult for Democrats to figure out how they balance really driving up Black turnout with also promising the kinds of things that will get Latino voters to the polls. So this is not a problem that Republicans have, right? So it just speaks to kind of a fundamental asymmetry in what the parties have to do. But it's pretty clear that if Biden spoke more about his economic plan and perhaps framed it in some of the ways that would appeal more to Latino males, then you would think that there would be more traction there.
Thank you. Benjamin, you mentioned the primaries, and there were some divisions, right, within the Democratic Party between Latinos and African Americans in terms of support. One question that we have from our audience members from the chat is, what are the implications on alliances with African Americans who may see Latinos as an unreliable ally, given the divisions that have been present, right, during the primary campaign?
This has been an issue for the longest time. And I think that it's an issue that is more visible in the presidential campaign, more visible at the national level than it probably is at the local level. If we think about the kind of people who became the architects of the Latino vote, the Edward Roybals of the world, the Herman Badillos of the world, they were all supported by African Americans at home. They all had multiracial coalitions. They all came out of constituencies that banded together in the face of exclusion. So in Los Angeles, in New York, in San Antonio, and in many other places, Latino elected officials have come to represent African-American voters in important ways. And so it speaks to, I think, Professor Fraga's point about at the local level, what really I think needs to be happening is that those kinds of organizations actually interface with each other pretty well, comparatively speaking. There's maybe fewer egos or different kind of egos than if it's the head of LULAC talking with the head of the NAACP or something like that. There are local issues, local alliances built around kind of multiracialism and working class issues have shown that this doesn't have to be a problem.
Yeah. And I think it's important to think about if we separate out the leadership, right? Older leadership, right? In the African-American community, in the Latinx community to some degree, although the leadership structure is a lot more nebulous, right? We don't have national leadership in quite the same way as in the African-American community. But the older African-American leadership, as opposed to younger African-American voters who didn't vote in the primary, who didn't support Joe Biden, some of whom supported Bernie Sanders, but also who didn't vote in 2016. So exactly the African-American voters the Democrats need to turn out to vote. Now, if you look at the opinion polling for younger African-Americans and younger Latinxs, there's no daylight between the two, right? Very, very, very similar opinions on a number of issues, right? There is the potential for some kind of BIPOC coalition, right? That we see when we look at the youth. It's really at the elite level, and especially for older members of both of those communities, where you see, right, more disagreement because it's about sharing power. It's about attention and power. It's about dollars in many ways too, in terms of where campaign funds are going to be directed, which communities are going to get mobilized, which candidates are going to be supported, right? But even within the communities, right, we see an age variation that is very important, right? Jim Clyburn's endorsement of Joe Biden right before the South Carolina primary was key. I mean, Joe Biden would not be the nominee today, right, and potentially the president, if not for that key endorsement by an old guard African-American elected official, right? In a red state that will not vote Democratic anytime soon, right? At least not for president. Now, think about that versus the power of Latinx leadership to the extent it exists in places like Texas and Arizona, which now look much, much more like purple states, Arizona perhaps even a blue state, in this presidential election. So I think that it begs the question about the priorities of the Democratic Party, right? In terms of the future coalitions that they want to build, a multiracial coalition, where also, let's not forget, young white voters also have a lot of agreement with young African Americans and young Latinxs on a number of issues, versus catering to the old guard and the older interests that frankly didn't work in 2016.
It sounds like the Democratic Party's leadership is going to have to really do some soul searching based on what happens in the election. One question that has come up in the chat as well, has Trump's racist rhetoric, particularly about Mexicans, impacted Latino support? Does this rhetoric trump, pun intended, ideological differences among Latinos?
Well, let me just speak to this briefly because there was an earlier question about, Latinx support for Trump. So look, political scientists, if there's one key kind of understanding that we have about American elections, it's that party matters a whole lot. We talk about this concept of party identification, a psychological attachment to one of the two political parties that we carry with us. It's not who we vote for, it defines our identity to the point where if I ask most of you are a Democrat or Republican, you'd be able to answer, and that's not the same as are you voting for Biden or for Trump, although they coincide quite a bit. It's that thing you carry with you all the time. Now, just like for other racial and ethnic groups, there happen to be Republicans in the Latinx population. I don't think that Trump is doing especially well, and he's not peeling off Latinx Democrats and convincing them to vote for him, at least not in large numbers. What he is doing is keeping the Latinx Republicans, and again, this puzzles, especially white analysts. They say, I don't understand how any Latinx person can be voting for or supporting Trump. It's like, because they're Republicans, right? Just like the 90% of other Republicans who voted for Trump, just like the majority of white women who voted for Trump, despite his rhetoric and his record and his behavior, quite frankly. So, I mean, I think that when we think about Latinx Republicans in isolation, we tell a story that's much more about the rhetoric and the policies. But when we think about it more broadly, the answer that I come to at very least is some Latinxs are Republican, right? The history of why they're Republican, I think, is more interesting than thinking about why they happen to be consistent in their vote choice in 2016 and perhaps 2020.
Yeah, there's another question here in the chat talking about sort of Latino republicanism. To what extent do you see the issue of abortion rights impacting the Latinx vote pattern by party? Yeah, right. And so the nature of Latinx conservatism in relation to social issues like abortion, I imagine matter a great deal.
I can make a little stab at it. It goes to show you that that even if the issue is out there in the world, it doesn't necessarily become a Latino issue until someone wants to really emphasize it as a Latino issue. I'm thinking back to the presidential campaign of Jimmy Carter, and there was a question about, well, should you say anything? Should you say anything about this as a question? They said, well, just don't talk about it. This isn't really an issue that we have to talk about with this constituency. If we just ignore it, it goes away. But it was clear that Hispanic Republicans wanted to make it an issue and wanted to make it a defining test of Latino identity. So it seems to me that when Trump began his evangelical outreach, for example, his evangelical outreach has strongly overlapped with the Hispanic outreach, particularly in Florida. I think the evangelical outreach kickoff event actually took place at a Hispanic church in Florida. So again, this is thinking about Latinos as being sort of a lot like other voters that Republicans are interested in activating around this particular question right now, and particularly with the Supreme Court nomination.
Excellent. Let's see here. We are at our time limit. Do you all have any parting shots in terms of the 2020 election, how it might unfold, the issues that I've outlined in relation to the Latino vote? Yeah, and anything that you might want to tell our audience of college-age students that might be sort of absorbing information, wanting to take it to their classes and wanting to figure out what to do when it comes to voting?
I'll just say, be patient, because I think that this is going to be a long haul. And as someone who was of college age during the 2020 election, I think, many of us were sort of confused about what to do when the election didn't end on the night of the voting. And there's going to have to be kind of endurance and engagement beyond just actually casting the ballot, I suspect. This doesn't speak specifically to the Latino vote, but it speaks to the kind of stamina that people who are interested in democracy are going to need to maintain in the months ahead.
Yeah, there's a question here I see in the chat about predictions. My prediction is we're going to have to be patient for the election results. I agree.
Yeah.
That's going to be really key. But my prediction is that it is going to be, we're going to see very high rates of voter turnout. We're not going to see the disparities in turnout that I discussed, disappear. We're not going to see them get smaller even. In fact, they're going to get even worse because the most engaged voters in the election are the ones with higher rates of education and higher incomes, right? Not surprisingly in some ways, it's the people who are already very highly activated. So my message to all of you, right, is to make a plan to vote. Not just commit to voting, but make a plan to vote. Figure out how you're going to do it. In your home states, are you going to mail in a ballot? Have you already requested your ballot? If not, do you have a plan to vote early in person? Do you have a plan to vote on election day? Where do you vote? What hours is your polling station open? Is your voter registration updated? All of this information, right? You need to make sure that you can have as smooth as possible a voting process. Make sure that you have it written down, perhaps have a plan to vote because your vote does matter. Your vote is your voice. Please use it.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't have said it better, to be patient and to make a plan to vote. I'd like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for participating, the two of you for sharing your wisdom with us, and everyone for attending here from the bottom of my heart. The study of the Latino vote ahead of elections, I think, is incredibly important, and it teaches a lot. It teaches us a lot about American politics as we proceed, as the country sort of unfolds in its democratic experiment. So thank you very much for your research, and thank you very much for coming here. And yeah, thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for having us.
I will
Thank
catch
you.
you later. Thank you.
Take care.